I should begin with a caveat. My talk promises you a lecture about art of the Dutch 17th century, the so-called Golden Age. I will be talking a lot about that material, but I'm also going to be ranging a bit further afield. And in fact, I want to begin my lecture with a work of 20th century art, one of the very few here at the Frick Collection, something that you all passed under as you walked into the museum today, but may not have spent too much time looking at. This is Sherry Edmondson Fry's 1913 pediment sculpture for the Frick Mansion. Even in 1913, this was a pretty conservative work of art, one that looked back to clear art historical precedents. We might cite Cellini's Nymph of Fontainebleau, another pediment sculpture built around the figure of a reclining nude woman destined for an architectural setting. The pediment sculpture here at the Frick also refers to the long tradition of Venetian paintings of reclining nude women as allegorical figures of beauty. This is a sculpture that gives us a preview of the space of art and aesthetics that we're entering into as we pass into the Frick. It's striking that this is a collection notably devoid in nudes, so it's a bit of false advertising on the front of the building, but be that as it may. In the nearly 3 years that I spent here at the Frick, I became pretty fascinated with this sculpture, and I have to say that wasn't really for its aesthetic merits or the art historical citations that it makes, but really for the story of the woman who modeled for it. The model was named Audrey Munson. You see her in a photograph on the left. She was a very well-known figure in the New York art world of the 19-teens. She modeled for dozens of statues around the city and the country. You see some examples on the right. You can find websites online that will give you listings of all of the sculptures around the world for which she served as model. And she was so famous as an artist model and for her perfect figure according to the ideals of the day that she was actually cast in the role of an artist model in a 1915 silent film, Inspiration. You see a still from that film on the screen. And Munson holds the distinction of being the first woman to appear in the nude in an American movie. Her career ended tragically. In 1919, the owner of the boarding house on the Upper West Side that she lived in murdered his wife, and he told investigators it was so that he would be free to marry Munson. There was no evidence that she was involved at all in the crime or that they had any sort of prior romantic relationship, but the scandal that became attached to her name was such that her modeling career ended, and the rest of her life was really a sort of tragic series of increasingly sleazy publicity stunts, mental illness, suicide attempts. In 1931, she was institutionalized by her mother upstate, and she actually remained in that institution for an astonishing 65 years. She lived to be 104 years old, but without ever regaining her freedom. So it's a really heartbreaking story that I think once you know it, changes the way you look at that sculpture. In 1921, before sort of the worst of these events, there was a series of ghost-written articles that appeared under Munson's name in Hearst Sunday magazine. And in one of these, she poses the question, what becomes of the artist's models? I am wondering if many of my readers have not stood before a masterpiece of lovely sculpture or a remarkable painting of a young girl, her very abandonment of draperies accentuating rather than diminishing her modesty and purity, and asked themselves the question, where is she now, this model who was so beautiful? And this question, what becomes of the artist's models, is one that has fascinated me for a long time, one that I was engaged with when I was writing my dissertation here at the Frick. For me, it's emblematic of a new line of inquiry in art history that looks into the power dynamics of the studio, the different kinds of labor that go on in the studio, the different contributions, not just of the solitary genius, but also of the artist's model, of the artist's assistants. And this is a line of inquiry that I think builds on a famous pronouncement by the art historian Michael Baxendall that a work of art is the deposit of a social relationship. He meant, in that context, the social relationship between artist and patron, but I think we're starting to expand that to include the artist model as well as other figures. And this question, what becomes of the artist models, or who were the artist models, is one that has been posed very productively in recent years in a series of exhibitions and publications by scholars who work primarily on 19th century art and on issues of race and art. So I'm thinking here particularly of the splendid exhibition that was held at Columbia University last year, Posing Modernity, curated by my colleague Denise Morel, about the figure of the Black model in modernism from Manet onward. There's also been the really fascinating recovery of the life and work of the Jamaican-born pre-Raphaelite model, Fanny Eaton, someone whom you suddenly begin to recognize in one pre-Raphaelite painting after another. She's a key figure in an exhibition currently at the National Portrait Gallery in London. And later this winter, we can all look forward to an exhibition dedicated to the relationship between John Singer Sargent and his model, Thomas Eugene McKellar, whom you see on the far right in one of Sargent's watercolors. In my own field of Northern Baroque painting from the Dutch Republic and Flanders, the question of the relationship between artists and models has been largely treated more by poets and novelists than by art historians. On the screen, you see a still of Colin Firth and Scarlett Johansson in the film adaptation of Tracy Chevalier's best-selling novel, Girl with the Pearl Earring. And it's simply a fact that we don't know a single thing about Vermeer's models. As compelling as those images are, we have no idea who these women were. People might identify them as his wife or his daughter, a member of his household, a maidservant, but there's no shred of evidence to either confirm or dispute those identifications. So I think it's natural, given the fascination that these pictures exert, that novelists have stepped into the breach to fill in what art historians can't know. That said, we do know a little bit about artist models in the 17th century Dutch Republic. On the screen is a painting by the artist Dirk Bleeker of the Penitent Magdalene, now hanging in the Rijksmuseum. And we know that the woman who modeled for this was named Marie Jonas de Lamotte. We know that because of court records. She was someone who spent a lot of time in and out of jail in Haarlem. She was a prostitute. She was arrested for sex work. She was also involved in a knife fight. And it's thanks to those trial records that we know that she was Bleeker's model, clearly a figure on the margins of society, someone who had a very difficult life. And certainly we know that women who posed in the nude were not respectable figures in the 17th century. They very often were sex workers of one kind or another. Certainly their reputations were imperiled by this practice of posing in the nude. And again, I think when we know the story of the arrests, the knife fight, behind this painting, it becomes difficult to look at it in quite the same way. And that tension between the beautiful finished work of art and this whole social world that went into its making is one of the key themes that I want to explore in my lecture today. This lecture will have three main parts. So I'm going to begin by reflecting on my time here at the Frick, the exhibition that I curated, and the artist Anthony van Dyke, who really has been the central focus of my scholarship throughout my career. And he's an artist who I think sheds a lot of light on these issues of dynamics between artists and their models in the studio. And then I'm going to shift toward 17th century Dutch art proper to discuss my experience of working with undergrads, teaching them about the Dutch paintings here at the Frick and what I learned from that. And finally, I'm going to just give you a little preview of my own current research into one particular artist's model from the 17th century Netherlands, someone we know a good deal about. So on the screen, you see Van Dyck's self-portrait from the Met, a painting that I pinch myself that I now am the curator of. This was a central picture in our exhibition here at the Frick in 2016. Van Dyke is a really interesting artist for thinking about power dynamics in the studio. He came of age artistically as a young assistant in the studio of Peter Paul Rubens, a sort of overwhelming figure of protean talent, pan-European fame. And Van Dyke, you can think of him as a real case study of what the late Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence. A lot of very ambitious young men worked in Rubens's studio and became basically absorbed, basically anonymous within his operation. And for Van Dyke to carve his own path, he had to, in a sense, reject a lot of Rubens. He learned a lot from Rubens, but he also rejected a lot about his art. And one of the ways that he did that was to turn himself into his own model. So self-portraiture plays a central role in Van Dyke's art throughout his career, and it's self-portraiture that involves a kind of role play. So there was a long tradition in Flanders in the 16th century of artists depicting themselves as proud artisans sitting at their easels, showing the tools of their trade, the palette, the brushes. Van Dyke rejects that. Instead, he's playing the role of a young courtier here. We think he painted this when he was 21, visiting the English court for the first time, and he's magnificently nonchalant. He's got his cuffs rolled back, there's lace spilling forth from his sleeve, and above all, he has these fabulous, languid, pale, almost boneless hands that don't seem to have done a day's work in his entire life. So there's absolutely no indication that this young man is a painter, that he made the painting before us. He's playing a role, crafting a sort of artistic identity for himself that would then become his brand. And Van Dyke went even further in adopting the role of the artist model. He painted a really fascinating series of depictions of Saint Sebastian early in his career when he was just emerging from Rubens's studio. And when I was here at the Frick, I wrote an article where I argued that these depictions of the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian are really allegories of the model in the studio. If you think of other depictions you've seen of Saint Sebastian, he's tied to a tree, he's pierced with arrows. That's the really standard iconography that we all recognize. Van Dyke does away with that. He sort of rewinds the tape to show Sebastian being bound to the tree, posed, literally, by these older men, and he's very obviously put his own face onto the body of the saint. Although there were women who modeled for artists in the 17th century, these marginal figures, mostly prostitutes like the woman I discussed modeling for Dirk Blaker, Marie Delamot, most models, the vast majority, were young apprentices. It was part of your duties to model for your master. It was one way you learned about art. And Van Dyke seems to be referring to that tradition in posing himself as this beautiful young man who is put into a position by an older figure in this very menacing way. When Van Dyke is coming of age as a young artist in Rubens' studio, it's the great moment of Caravaggio's reception across Europe. Caravaggio, probably more than any other painter, is associated with dependence on the life model, embrace of the lowliness of the model, and that's something that Van Dyke really picks up on himself. On the screen, I'm showing you a very remarkable work that was just rediscovered in the past few months. It's something that turned up at an estate sale in upstate New York about 20 years ago, was bought by a very savvy collector for $600, but has now been re-identified as the figure study for Van Dyke's breakthrough masterpiece, the St. Jerome, now in Rotterdam. You see here Van Dyke studying a very weathered old man, clearly someone who is a laborer, who has had a hard life of physical labor, still powerfully muscular, but very much a melancholy figure, a haunting figure, and all of these qualities then get translated into the final picture, this very haunting image that juxtaposes the elderly, ascetic, hermetic saint with this beautiful young angel. And there's a frisson of realism that Van Dyke gets from grounding his devotional paintings in studies of real models from the lower classes. We don't know a thing, again, about who this man was, other than that he was probably another marginal figure in society. But you do recognize him over and over again in Van Dyke's early paintings. He was clearly a favorite model. Now, I should say this is not the sort of painting that we figured prominently in our exhibition here at the Frick. It was a show about Van Dyke, the portraitist, not Van Dyke, the religious painter. And that reflects the strengths of the Frick's own holdings in Van Dyke. Henry Clay Frick actually bought more paintings by Van Dyke than any other artist, a total of 12. But those were not Catholic altarpieces. They were very glamorous portraits. So here in this installation shot, you see the Met self-portrait juxtaposed with the Frick's great pendant portraits of Franz Sneiders and Margareta de Vos. I hope you'll go take a look at those in the West Gallery after this lecture. And it is as the very glamorous, the very elegant society portraitist that Van Dyke is primarily remembered today. For paintings like this one, also from the Frick's collection depicting Lady Anne Carey, later Countess Clanbrassil, a young English aristocrat in the mid-1630s. This is a painting that recycles a formula Van Dyke used over and over again in his British career. He's depicting this young noblewoman almost as a kind of Arcadian shepherdess, a very glamorous shepherdess, but she's not wearing realistic costume that she would have worn in public. A young woman would never have exposed that much of her chest. This is fancy dress, masquerade costume almost, and she's striding across this woodland landscape that is a studio confection. It's totally insulated from the very tense political realities that the English aristocracy were facing in the 1630s. This is a time of utmost tension between Van Dyke's great patron, Charles I, and Parliament, between the Puritans and the High Church Anglicans. These are all tensions that would erupt 1 year after Van Dyke's death in 1641 in the English Civil War. And at the climax of the Civil War, Charles I was beheaded outside of Whitehall Banqueting Hall. So there's a whole social, political world that is, of course, being bracketed, left outside the frame of this portrait. And it's precisely for that reason that after the restoration of the monarchy, Van Dyke's English portraits came to seem like the Edenic images of a lost golden age of the English aristocracy. And in that capacity, they were drawn upon, reused, cited in upper-class Anglo-American portraiture well into the 20th century. There's a really fantastic example of that here at the Frick in Gainsborough's 1777 portrait of the Honorable Frances Duncombe. She's wearing what was known in the 18th century as Van Dyke dress. This was the most popular form of masquerade costume in England throughout the 18th century. It cites actual paintings by both Van Dyke and Rubens in a kind of pastiche of 17th century attire. We think that Duncombe's portrait was commissioned by the family of her fiancé, Lord Folkestone, heir to the Earl of Radnor. And the Radnors, although they had titles and a castle, they were newly ennobled. Their origins in the 17th century were mercantile and Huguenot. They weren't the kind of people who had their own ancestral portraits by Van Dyke. So one way that they compensated for that was they bought an Elizabethan castle and they filled it with other people's ancestral portraits, a practice that has gone on throughout the centuries. They actually bought the portrait of Anne Carey's mother, and they also commissioned portraits of themselves from Gainsborough in Van Dyke fancy dress, including this one of Frances Duncombe. Fortunately for us in New York, Frances Duncombe broke off her engagement to Lord Folkestone, and she took the portrait with her, which is why we can enjoy it in New York today when the rest of the series is still at Longford Castle. Van Dyke fancy dress continued to be very popular on both sides of the Atlantic well into the era when Henry Clay Frick was building his collection. So you see just one representative example out of many on the screen. I like to think that this photograph could serve as an illustration to my favorite scene in Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, where she talks about a group of young society women posing as tableau vivant from art history. And she mentions a young Mrs. Van Alstyne who made a characteristic Van Dyke in black satin against a curtained archway. And it's a testament to Van Dyke's cultural currency in the late 19th century that everyone knew what a characteristic Van Dyke looked like. Van Dyke was such a household name in this period, not just because of masquerade costume, but also because American collectors were avidly acquiring his portraits. On the screen, you see an installation view from the Met in 1897 of the Marquand Gallery, named for our great trustee and benefactor, Henry Marquand. And the focal point of this gallery is Van Dyke's portrait of the Duke of Richmond and Lennox, one of the great courtiers at the court of Charles I. Marquand acquired this picture in 1886 for a really unfathomable sum, $40,000 at the time, from the collection of Lord Methuen at Corsham Court, one of the great English aristocratic collections of the 18th century. And Lord Methuen had tried to quietly sell the picture to the National Gallery in London. They couldn't afford it or weren't interested. He then had to stoop to seeking out an American buyer. And Marquand was very apologetic about buying this picture. He said, "I know it must be a struggle to part with such old friends. They will, however, educate a new country and do good service, I trust, where they are going." So there really was this didactic mission in bringing these images of utmost civilization and refinement to the raw new world. This was the first major Van Dyke portrait to arrive in the United States, and it really became a focal point at the Met and has remained one of our great paintings ever since. And it's fascinating that Marquand actually sought out the advice of John Singer Sargent when he made this purchase, Singer Sargent being the expatriate American painter who was described by Rodin as the Van Dyke of our age. And a year after the portrait was purchased, Sargent paid tribute to Marquand by painting a portrait of Mrs. Marquand. That's a clear homage to Van Dyke's portrait. So she's not literally in Van Dyke fancy dress, but she has this wonderful lace collar and, of course, these pale, slender hands with splayed fingers that are so clearly Van Dykean. And it really, I think, is a measure of the cultural maturation of the United States that not only had American collectors begun to acquire great Van Dyke portraits, but we also had produced a painter who a Frenchman would call the Van Dyke of the age. This link between Van Dyke and very elite collecting practices has persisted into our own lifetimes. On the screen, you see Cecil Beaton's wonderful photograph of Jane Wrightsman in her Fifth Avenue apartment. Mrs. Wrightsman and her husband Charles were, of course, the greatest benefactors the Met has had, at least since World War II. Just an astonishing series of generous gifts. And during their own lifetimes, they gave many of the things that you even see in this photograph, the Vermeer study of a young woman, the mice and birds in the background, to the museum. But there were certain things that Mrs. Wrightsman held on to all of her life that only came to the Met when she passed away at the age of 99 this past April. And one of those was a fantastic Van Dyke portrait depicting Henrietta Maria, Queen to Charles I. This was a very important diplomatic gift that Henrietta Maria commissioned to give to the Barberini Cardinal in Rome. And it's one that initiated a whole series of workshop versions, but this is the primary version, the autograph version, entirely in Van Dyke's own hand. So a truly exquisite example of his royal portraiture, the way that he creates these icons of royal majesty. I was lucky enough to actually see this picture in Mrs. Wrightsman's apartment. She kept it hanging over the sofa in her private study where she would receive intimate guests. And I think it's a testament into the way that Van Dyke has continued to be a touchstone for a certain kind of collector into the 21st century. Now, one thing to point out about this portrait is if we want to think of it as, in Baxendall's terms, the deposit of a social relationship, this isn't just that binary relationship between patron and artist, sitter and artist. It's really a triangle between sitter, artist, and hired model. We know this from the documentary sources that it was considered far too tedious for the Queen herself to stand while Van Dyke documented all the details of her costume. So this is a portrait that would have been painted in 2 successive stages. He would have taken her likeness, her face, in her presence, but then this beautiful yellow dress that she wears would have been sent to his studio for a hired model to wear while he captured all the details. And Van Dyke's first biographer actually tells us that he kept what this biographer calls a stable of models at his house who were distinguished for their beautiful hands. So those hands that are a Van Dyke trademark are not necessarily the product of his imagination. They're certainly probably not what the Queen's hands looked like. They're the hands of a now completely unknown woman. And in our exhibition here at the Frick, we included this drawing on the right from the collection of the Met, where you see Van Dyke studying costume, studying hands in preparation for a portrait, probably studying hands and costume on a hired model, someone who's now otherwise totally lost to the historic record. There is let's say, a darker side, of course, to this relationship between artists and models, or even a sort of a more troubling side than what I've already described. And it's something that's come to the fore in discussions about a particular feature of Van Dyke's portraits and the portraits that he inspired. So on the screen, you see the depiction of a Genoese noblewoman with her attendant. She's standing under the parasol that he holds. This is now in the National Gallery in Washington. And this inclusion of an attendant figure of color is a very common feature in 17th and 18th century portraiture. It's a signifier of wealth, of luxury, of access to international trade routes that, of course, were dealing in people as well as commodities. It's something you see over and over again, a very troubling feature to a 21st century audience, of course. And we really can say almost nothing historically about these attendant figures, about who they were. We don't know, was this the actual enslaved servant of this woman? Was he included on the basis of a drawing Van Dyke had made on his travels? Is this, like the landscape, a sort of studio invention? We really don't know. We certainly can't give names in almost any cases to these figures. But images like this have become really central to academic conversations about the visibility of Black Africans in early modern Europe, about the dependence of early modern wealth and cultural achievement on the transatlantic slave trade, on colonialism. You see an important book on the subject here with the Washington painting as its cover. And these conversations have prompted very belated, very overdue changes at museums in how we label, how we title and discuss paintings like this in our own collections. So at the Met, we've undertaken an initiative only in the last few years to retitle pictures like this one, a double portrait by Nicolas de Largière of a wealthy French woman with a young man of African origin, and he actually wears a padlocked collar around his neck. And of course, a 21st century audience confronted with this picture, I don't think their first questions are about Largière's artistic influences or citations he may be making. I think they want an acknowledgement of the second figure in the painting. They want a discussion of slavery and what it means for the history of European art. And we've only really, I think, belatedly begun to catch up to the questions that that our audience has in the way that we label pictures like this one. Now, some of you may have noticed that the title of my talk has the phrase Golden Age in quotation marks. A few things to talk about that. I know there are a few Dutch people in the audience, and I know I haven't talked about Dutch art yet, but Van Dyke is not Dutch. Van Dyke is Flemish, and I've also been looking at British material. We're going to shift now into the Dutch material proper. More seriously, this phrase, Golden Age, is one that has become increasingly contested, increasingly controversial in recent years, particularly in a historical context. Golden Age is, of course, not something that 17th century people use to describe their own period. It's a retrospective appellation, and it's one that historians, particularly in the Netherlands, have started to reject, pointing out that, of course, the Golden Age was also the age in which the Dutch were pioneers of the international slave trade when they engaged in extremely brutal colonial warfare in what is now Malaysia and Indonesia in order to obtain control of the spice trade. So some Dutch cultural institutions, certainly not all, have begun to jettison the term altogether. The most prominent example is probably the Amsterdam Museum, the Museum of the History of the city. And they've announced that they will no longer use this term in any of their materials. And they've also undertaken a really interesting project to commission a series of fictive or imaginary portraits of people of color from the Dutch 17th century, people who are documented in archival sources, but for whom no portraits survive, because we have this strange situation where we have lots of people of color who appear in 17th century paintings, but we don't know anything about them. And then the people who we do know about from archival sources were not the sort of people who had their own portraits painted in most cases. So the Amsterdam Museum has commissioned this series of photographs to display alongside 17th century portraits. You see one example by the photographer Humberto Tan on the screen. And I think these are really healthy, very powerful moves of institutional self-critique. I think we really need to stop relying on cliches like Golden Age. I think intellectually it isn't healthy to leave aside even the ethical issues, to just constantly rehearse these notions that particularly, I think, within a Dutch context are very much associated with a nationalist politics, are very much associated with a kind of self-congratulatory identity building. At the same time, I have to confess to some ambivalence because I am a booster of 17th century Dutch art. I love it. I think it's wonderful. I think this was a golden age of human civilization in terms of artistic production. It's incredible that this small country in one century produced Vermeer and Hals and Rembrandt. And I want to advertise that and I want to celebrate that. I don't think that these paintings are just commodities acquired with ill-gotten riches. That's, to me, a very reductive way to look at them. So there is a tension, and I do think there is a distinction between using the term golden age in an art historical context and a historical one, even as I hope I've shown, though we know that paintings certainly are not immune from social realities and certainly can be produced in very exploitative contexts. A little bit after I was hired at the Met, I was given the task, as Alexander mentioned, of curating a new installation of our 17th century Dutch paintings. And these are some of the most familiar, most beloved works in the Met's collection, things like Rembrandt's Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. But I wanted to tell a different story with them, to put them in something of a new light. And I came up with a thematic display that really emphasizes controversies, debates in the Dutch 17th century, focused on issues of aesthetics, issues of religion, consumption. And it was a challenge because this is a collection that was not built to tell a historical narrative. It's meant to be a collection of masterpieces by famous names. So I did have to go into storage, and about 10% of the pictures actually came out of storage. And I also used my labels to address blind spots, lacunae in this narrative that I couldn't fill with paintings. Like many curators, I love to eavesdrop on people in my exhibitions. Um, and a few months after this opened, I was in the galleries and I overheard a Dutch couple, and the husband said to his wife, "This is so American. They've mentioned slavery 3 times already." I'm sure he meant it as a compliment, and I certainly took it as one. One of the things that I got to do after I opened this exhibition was to teach a course to Barnard students where we met in the galleries for an entire semester. And now that I've finished congratulating myself and being very smug about my exhibition, I should say when I was asked to come up with a title for this course, without any self-reflection or irony, I said, let's call it Looking at the Dutch Golden Age. So that's pithy and succinct, and everyone knows what that is. I probably would change the title now, but I'm happy to say it was good advertising. We had twice as many applications for the course as we could accept, so don't let anyone tell you that undergrads only care about contemporary art. And teaching those students was a really wonderful experience for me. We met every week in the galleries. The idea was not only to introduce them to 17th century Dutch painting, but also to museum practice, to close looking, connoisseurship. We went into the conservation studio, we went to Sotheby's, they learned how auctions work, how acquisitions at a museum work. And as their final project, I asked them to submit exhibition proposals. And the task that I set them was to come down Fifth Avenue to the Frick and to propose an exhibition using the Frick's holdings of Dutch paintings that would do something similar to what I had done at the Met, to tell a historical, cultural narrative of the Dutch 17th century through the paintings here in the Frick collection. And I have to admit that even more than at the Met, I was asking my students to read this collection against the grain. This is a collection of masterpieces. It's a collection that is displayed in a very aesthetic and associative way, where, as you see on the screen, you could have a Rembrandt self-portrait displayed between 2 Turner landscapes. So it's a collection that I think we all love because of that. It invites close looking, immersion in works of art without the background noise of New York City, without extensive didactic labels that tell you a lot about the historical period. Works here aren't sorted by national school or chronology. And as wonderful as that is, I asked my students to sort of have the thought experiment of what else could you do with these paintings if your investments were in telling a very different kind of story, one grounded in the reading they had done about Dutch 17th century history. I became aware as the project went on sort of what a challenge this was going to be, because the Frick, as rich as the collections are, they do focus very much on certain genres. So the Dutch paintings here are wonderful for landscape painting, for portraiture. You see examples by Habema and Hals from the West Gallery. That's really what Frick loved above all. But there are noticeable lacunae here, as in any collection. What you won't see at the Frick are things like these paintings, 2 examples from the Met. On the left, a very bawdy, even obscene genre painting by Uteval. This was actually something that I had to plead with my boss to let me take out of storage, even at the Met. But I think it's been one of the sleeper hits of the show. And a more interesting or surprising lacuna here at the Frick would be still life painting, one of the defining genres of 17th century Dutch art, but not something that particularly interested Henry Clay Frick. Surprisingly, not something that has been appealing to many New York collectors, and an area of the collection at the Met that we're still actively trying to strengthen. So just one example of that here, of a kind of Dutch painting that you don't see at the Frick. And the nature of the Frick's Dutch collection was partly shaped by the way Dutch heritage was thought about in New York in the Gilded Age, when Clay Frick was making his acquisitions. So New York had an interesting inferiority complex in the late 19th century about the fact that its colonial history didn't really measure up to that of rival cities like Boston or Philadelphia. And prominent New Yorkers needed an alternate narrative, and they really latched onto the unique Dutch heritage of New York City and state. They decided that New York virtues like entrepreneurship, thrift, tolerance, these came from our Dutch progenitors. This is a narrative that's really still with us. You may have read Russell Shorto's Island at the Center of the World. But in the early 20th century, this identification with Dutch heritage, particularly on the part of families of Dutch descent, like the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts, culminated in this enormous festival in 1909, the HudsonFulton Celebration. And this was primarily a commemoration of Henry Hudson's navigation in 1609 of the river that would come to bear his name. And it was a huge urban festival. It featured things like a reconstruction of Hudson's vessel, the Half Moon, that sailed up the Hudson. But it also featured an art exhibition of Dutch paintings belonging to New York City private collectors. And Henry Clay Frick was a generous lender to this exhibition. You see his great late Rembrandt self-portrait here on display alongside the so-called Noble Slav, also by Rembrandt, a painting that now hangs in our galleries at the Met. And of course, my students included this kind of iconic masterpiece in their exhibition, along with the Vermeers. I don't want you to think that they neglected these pictures, but I was really amazed by the things that they located here in the collection that aren't on view. They went really deep into storage, into the collection catalog and the website to find things that would allow them to tell a different kind of story. So as much as I like to think that I'm pretty familiar with the collection here, I was quite surprised by some of the things that they located. So a lot of their shows included these harbor scenes, two pictures that may be unfamiliar to you, that are upstairs in the offices by Van de Capelle, by Rousdahl. And these pictures allowed my students to talk about trade, exchange, globalization as defining features of the Dutch 17th century. Some of my students even went further. They included in their exhibitions Turkish carpets that they found in the collection, Chinese blue and white export porcelain. They wanted to recreate the sense of the globalized Dutch interior in the 17th century. And that's something you see in other paintings from the Frick that may be unfamiliar to you, paintings that also hang upstairs. I mentioned the Frick is not particularly strong in that kind of naughty genre scene, but there are these two examples, pretty much always off view as far as I know, attributed to Bouteweg on the left, to Hendrik Terborg on the right. And my students use these pictures to talk about humor in Dutch art, sexuality, morality. We see in these so-called merry companies young people overindulging in tobacco, in alcohol, flirting with people they probably shouldn't be flirting with. These may in fact be brothel scenes, depending on which art historian you ask. But they also use these paintings to think about the display of art in the Dutch interior. Foreign travelers to the Netherlands would comment on the ubiquity of painting, the fact that even in taverns or houses of ill repute, you might see landscape paintings hanging on the wall. And gender was a particular concern of my students that they explored. For example, in this Metsu, this is an example of what we call high life genre painting as opposed to the low life of the examples in the previous slide. So it's an image that takes us behind closed doors into the intimate space of an elite woman's life. She's shown here at her dressing table, a very common theme in this kind of painting. And my students use this painting to think about the depiction of women, ideals of femininity, of beauty. And that was something they also explored in this one. And I was really happy to see a lot of them include this painting because it's a personal favorite. It actually hangs in the director's office upstairs, and I can't blame Ian for that. I would love to have this in my office. This is a portrait by Cara Terborg the Younger, my favorite 17th century Dutch painter, of an unknown young woman. We don't know her name. We only know her social status, what we can tell of it from her costume. Terborg worked really on the edges of the Dutch Republic in provincial cities on the border with the Holy Roman Empire, painting local prominent citizens. He had traveled widely as a young man. We know that he was in Madrid, where he studied the portraits of Velázquez, and he does this amazing thing of shrinking Spanish royal portraiture down to the sort of cozy dimensions of a Dutch burgher home. And that's one example. This is a small painting, an exquisite jewel-like portrait. And we have the great device here of the sober black overdress that's parted to show the satin underneath. And Terborg is famous as being the greatest painter of satin who's ever lived, something that conservators still don't quite understand how he achieved. And Terborg is a key figure in my current book project. One reason for that is that he really is the link between Van Dyke and Dutch high life genre painting. Terborg, as a very young man, was sent to London to be an apprentice to his uncle, who was an engraver, Robert van Voorst. And van Voorst was actually Van Dyke's engraver, engraving his portraits and distributing them. And it was through his uncle that Terborg somehow acquired this drawing on the left, Van Dyke's portrait of Charles I, a drawing now in the Rijksmuseum that we included in our exhibition here at the Frick, one of Van Dyke's most beautiful portrait drawings that stayed in the Terborg family until the 19th century. And Terborg, after his travels as a young man, he returned to his hometown of Zwolle in the east of the Dutch Republic, and he really invented a totally new type of genre painting there, this high life genre painting that I've mentioned. He's the founding figure, and a lot of art historians say this is the first example. Another painting in the collection of the Met depicting a young woman at her morning toilette. When Terborg returned to his hometown after all of these travels, he was reunited with his younger sister, Khazena. She was a very talented young woman, a calligrapher and an artist and poet in her own right. Like many young Dutch people, she enjoyed sort of unprecedented social freedoms compared to other European youths. She clearly had a lot of friends, a lot of suitors, and this elegant, creative, cultured life that she enjoyed seems to have been the spark that inspired Terborg to take the lives of elite women and make them the subject of this new kind of painting, high life genre. And it starts with this very intimate image of his sister. She's here working as his artist model, tightening her bodice while a maidservant waits with a pitcher and basin, a very small, very jewel-like image that's all about the thrill of seeing something private, something intimate. There were, of course, earlier depictions of women with mirrors, but those were moralizing warnings against feminine vanity. And all of that moral content, I would say, has been drained away. Instead, it's about paying attention, being observant to the everyday world, and particularly to these wonderful textures of the velvety pile of the chair, the satin of the skirt. Khazena Terborg, as I said, was an artist in her own right, and we can identify her and other members of the Terborg family as models in her brother's paintings because she preserved her own self-portrait and portraits of family members. The paintings don't come with identifying labels, but she labeled her portraits. So you see her own self-portrait on the right, and then you can recognize her again in a painting now in Helsinki, which is very representative of this kind of ambiguous suggestion of narrative in high life genre painting. This woman has received a letter. It's prompted her to knock back a glass of wine. We don't know more than that. We can fill it in with our imagination. And Khazena, her art was not a public art form. It took the form of drawings and calligraphy that she preserved in albums and would show to visitors to the house, but these weren't works of art that circulated on the art market like Carrard's paintings. But she clearly was very proud, very ambitious, very, very playful. This is a drawing that she made to celebrate her 30th birthday. She shows herself carving her initials and those of her lover into a tree. So there's these incredibly charming images of everyday life that become increasingly ambitious over the course of her work. And at the same time as they stand on their own, they offer a wonderful commentary to Carrard's paintings. So on the left, you see another of his paintings at the Met. It's given the modern title Curiosity, where we have three women. One is clearly of marriageable age. She's that classic Terborg lady in satin. Then there's a more matron-like figure who's writing a letter next to an opened letter. And there's the youngest woman who peers over her shoulder, so the curiosity of the title. And there's a general consensus that this older woman is writing a letter on her friend's behalf. She's helping her respond to a suitor. And so we're getting, again, a glimpse into women's lives that men normally wouldn't have. And there's also the wonderful detail of the dog perched on the stool, another curious voyeur figure. And we know from Khazena's albums that this was an actual family pet, and his name was Actaeon. And those of you who still have your mythology will know that Actaeon is the most notorious voyeur. He spied on Diana and her maidens, and as a punishment was turned into a stag and torn apart. So there seems to have been some sort of inter-sibling family joke going on about the nature of Terborg's art, this voyeuristic art represented by the voyeuristic little dog of his sister. Now, Khazena was an ambitious artist, even if her work didn't circulate on the market. And this is one of her most ambitious drawings. It's working with an international language of allegory to show the triumph of painting over death. And you even see Khazena's portrait borne aloft by Pudi, crowned with laurels. So she's not a particularly self-deprecating artist. She knew that she was good, just to give you a sense of her ambition. And her art is also one that gives us a sense that even in a provincial town in the Dutch Republic, life really had become globalized. She made this drawing of two young men of African origin on the left, and she noted pointedly that it was drawn from life. We wish that she had told us more about these men, but clearly she was in an environment touched by the transatlantic slave trade or the African slave trade. She also copied a Persian miniature into her albums. There's been a lot of ink spilled on Rembrandt's use of Mughal miniatures in his art, but there was clearly a broader circulation that also reached Khazena Terborg. So these are just a few indications of this world of the Dutch Republic that you can somehow unpack, discover when you look into an artist model's life. And it's something I hope to publish in the near future. Now, I want to take a leap forward. We began in the 20th century, and we're going to end in the 19th with the figure of another artist's sister, another artist's poetic sister, and that's Christina Rosetti, one of the great Victorian poets. You see her in a drawing by her brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. On the right, she's a key figure in the current exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in London, Pre-Raphaelite Sisters. And she's someone who I think really more than any art historian has left us a powerful statement of the relationship between artists and models. And that's a poem that she was prompted to write by the life story of her sister-in-law, Elizabeth Siddal. Elizabeth Siddal was a poet and an artist, but also an artist model, someone who posed for many of the members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. She famously posed in a bathtub for the figure of Ophelia in Millet's great painting now at the Tate that you see on the left. But she, like many of these models, had a very tragic life. Her relationship with Dante Gabriel Rossetti, whom she eventually married, was very tempestuous. He really dithered for a long time about whether he would actually marry her, make her a respectable woman. She lost their child. He was stillborn, and she became a laudanum addict and died at the age of just 32. So a very, very tragic history, and one that Christina Rosetti responded to in a poem that she called In an Artist's Studio. It's a sonnet, so it takes the form of the classic love poem, but really turns it on its head to reflect upon the experience of visiting her brother's studio after her sister-in-law's death, seeing all these images that he painted of her, and realizing that in them he didn't really see her. So I realized I didn't actually bring the text of the poem with me, so I'm going to crane my neck a little to read it to you, because I think I would like to give Christina Rosetti the last word today. So here's Christina Rosetti's In an Artist's Studio. One face looks out from all his canvases. One selfsame figure sits or walks or leans. We found her hidden just behind those screens. That mirror gave back all her loveliness, a queen in opal or in ruby dress, a nameless girl in freshest summer greens, a saint, an angel. Every canvas means the same one meaning, neither more or less. He feeds upon her face by day and night, and she with true kind eyes looks back on him, fair as the moon and joyful as the light, not wan with waiting, not with sorrow dim, not as she is, but was when hope shone bright, not as she is, but as she fills his dream. Thank you.